I'm Dale Newman, Director of the Truman Center at UMKC, and I want to welcome you to this, the 7th lecture in the Truman Legacy series that we began in November of 2007. The series was designed to look at developments in the Truman years that have continued to mark policy issues and choices over those years to the present. Tonight we will hear about the role of the United Nations in U.S. foreign policy from Truman to Obama. This event is special in yet another way in that every day when I enter the building where my office is located, I walk by a plaque that says Harry Truman gave a speech here, June 28, 1945. They don't tell you what the speech is. I will. It was the speech he gave upon receiving an honorary degree from the University of Kansas City, the private predecessor to UMKC, as he was flying back from the San Francisco conference where the UN Charter was signed. We're holding the event this week also because this week signals the 60th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, where the U.S. commitment to the UN was forcefully expressed at an early time, and again by Truman. These events don't happen by themselves, and so I want to thank some folks. I want to thank the Truman Presidential Library and Museum for their continued willingness to partner and co-sponsor these events. Amy Williams is here this evening from the Truman Library. Thank you, Amy. Also here this evening is Karen Morris, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, representing UMKC. The Bernard Haskell Lecture Foundation has provided some support for this event as well. And I also want to thank the Kansas City United Nations Association and the Kansas City International Relations Council for helping us to get the word out to their members about this meeting this evening. And I need to thank the Kaufman Foundation's Conference Center for providing the venue and its staff, Keely Wall and Stephanie Frost, for making sure all was in good order for our event. You've already seen some of the nice little goodies there, and so before you leave this evening, please help us finish off the platter. I also want to thank my assistant, Gaylor Curtis, who's still tending the table out in the hallway, for her many efforts on behalf of the Truman Center and its activities, which this month have also included many emails and phone calls from and to the two Truman Bootstrap student interns working in Congress. We have one working for Senator McCaskill and one working for Congressman Cleaver. She's had to handle a number of phone calls about what do we do about this, how do I handle that, and she's done well doing those things and also helping prepare for our speaker. And I'm now pleased to present our speaker for this evening, Dr. Meena Bose, who is Peter S. Calico Chair in Presidential Studies at Hofstra University and Director of Hofstra University's Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency. She is the author of Shaping and Signaling Presidential Policy, National Security Decision-Making of Eisenhower and Kennedy in 1998, and editor of the reference volume, The New York Times on the Presidency, published in 2009. She is also co-editor of several volumes in presidential studies and a reader in American politics, and she is a contributor to the textbook, American Government, Institutions and Policies, now in its 12th edition, edited by James Q. Wilson and John DeLeo Jr. Her current research focus, which is why we brought her here this evening, is on presidential leadership in the United Nations. In addition to being a frequent media commentator on the presidency, Dr. Bose has designed and taught courses for Elder Hostel, and she was scholar in residence for a nonpartisan course sponsored by the Washington Center in connection with the 2008 Republican National Convention in Minneapolis. She taught for 6 years at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where she also serves as the Director of American Politics. Dr. Bose previously taught at Hofstra University from 1996 to 2000. Long Island Business selected her as one of the top 40 under 40 leaders on Long Island in 2009. She received her undergraduate degree in international politics from Penn State University and her master's and doctoral degrees from Princeton University. Dr. Bose, all yours.
Thank you, Professor Newman. It's so nice to be here today. As I look at the two presidents' names up here, Truman and Obama, I can't help but reflect how interesting it is to be in Truman's home state on a day when he's in the news so much. If anyone was watching the news, I guess the 5 o'clock news here, of course, there have been many comparisons made today to President Truman's dismissal of General MacArthur in the spring of '51 and questions about whether President Obama will need to do the same with General McChrystal in Afghanistan. That's not the focus of my talk, but if we have time for some discussion of that, I'm glad to engage that. I think it's a very interesting question and some similar issues at stake. I want to just add my thanks first and foremost to Professor Newman and to Gayla Curtis for bringing me here, to Dean Forrest, there you are, and to the Truman Library for making this possible. I spent some time at the Truman Library this afternoon, and it was kind of a quick review of some boxes. I visited the Eisenhower Library in the mid-1990s, and at the time I wasn't able to come to the Truman Library, so it's a treat to be able to come to Kansas City International Airport today and actually stay in Missouri. What I should offer a little bit of a caveat about the title of my lecture here. When Professor Newman and I discussed this talk, he asked me to ground my analysis in the Truman administration and then bring it up to the present. And I said I'd be glad to do that. However, I'm not going to talk about the United Nations in each administration from Truman through Obama. If I did that, I would have roughly 4 minutes per president. And even then, that would probably be a little bit over. And now, in the Cold War years, actually, we could actually cover quite a bit because the UN played such a limited role. But from Bush 1 up into the Obama administration, there's actually quite a bit to discuss. So in my talk today, I'm actually going to focus on 3 key decisions on military intervention by the UN Security Council. The Korean War in 1950, the Persian Gulf War the decision by the UN Security Council to authorize the war in November 1990, and then the Iraq War decision-making in 2002, 2003. And then I'll say a little bit about President Obama as well to bring this up to the present. So I'll say a little bit more in a few minutes about why I've picked those cases. But let me start with that. Oh, and I should say, too, that I recognize that I run the risk of revealing my time at an Army institution at West Point by using PowerPoint. There was an article in the New York Times. It was right before Memorial Day. I gave a lecture then, and I used PowerPoint that was actually addressing the problems with PowerPoint in the Army, the 80-slide briefings, and when you receive the paper copies as well. I promise you that's not what I have here. I do have slides, but I use slides in my lectures and my classes more to organize my points. And so, for me, so I don't have to write on the board. And I do think a visual is helpful, but I'm not planning to bludgeon you with the slides. I wanted to start with a quotation from President Truman in June 1945. It will be just as easy for nations to get along in a republic of the world as it is for us to get along in the Republic of the United States. Very idealistic rhetoric, very optimistic, hopeful, for the new organization, the international organization, the United Nations. And, as I discovered as I was preparing for this lecture, a statement made at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Now, I don't think anyone here was probably in the audience at the time. However, I do have Professor Newman. I did find in your slideshow of the short history of the long road to the Truman's. Yes. Well, in there is a picture of Truman's honorary diploma from UMKC in 1945. And it was when he came here to receive that diploma that he gave this speech. Now, President Truman, when he made this statement, was actually paraphrasing a poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson, Locksley Hall, from the early 1837. And this is quite a long poem. I have to tell you, I printed out the whole poem. I was reading it the other day. And it's a story about a soldier who returns to the home, Locksley Hall, where he was raised. It's a story of lost love. And then it moves into a very kind of futuristic view of what will happen in the world. And when you think that Tennyson wrote this in 1837, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled, in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. It's interesting, when you read that, you can see why he was the poet laureate for Queen Victoria for so many years. Just there's a turn of phrase here. The reason I put this up here is that President Truman, in 1910, was a senior in high school. He read Locksley Hall in school. And the words meant so much to him that he actually wrote down these stanzas on a piece of paper and carried them in his wallet. And when a reporter, Merriman Smith from United Press International, asked him in 1945 why he was referencing Locksley Hall, or why he had used the words that he did, you can see how this is close to the quotation from his speech. He said that he had showed the reporter these words that he had carried. And I just think it's very interesting that Harry Truman in 1910, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking, he was born in 1884. He would have been 26 in 1910. So he must have actually written those down earlier, because I was just looking at the McCullough book today. He read this in high school, wrote it down, that these words meant so much to him. And I'm not sure that this was something he kept with him into his presidency. The Parliament of Man, that's the title of a book that the historian Paul Kennedy at Yale University used for his book on the United Nations a few years ago. The Federation of the World, Common Sense of Most, right, the Direct Democracy, and Lapped in Universal Law. If this were a poetry reading, we could discuss what Tennyson meant by that. But when I bring this up just to show what Truman's, the kind of instinctive sentiment that Truman had, support for the United Nations, and how that influenced his actions in his presidency. And in some ways, what I'd like to discuss today, how that view from presidents how presidents and the United States' view of the United Nations has changed since the founding of the organization in 1945. Two questions that I'd like to talk about today. The first one I've already referred to. How has the United States worked through the United Nations to build international coalitions for military intervention? Then the second one, how has the permanent representative to the UN pursued the president's agenda at the UN? I'll say more about the second question in a moment. This is my research project that I'm working on. It's a book project looking at the role of the president's permanent representative, or the ambassador to the United Nations, the position that Susan Rice currently holds, Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke held in the Clinton administration, John Negroponte held that, was the first person to hold that in the George W. Bush administration. In the past, we can look to Adlai Stevenson under John F. Kennedy, Henry Cabot Lodge under Eisenhower, and Warren T. Austin, the senator from Vermont, under Truman. And I'll say more about him in a moment. But I've put my own research as a student of the presidency and presidential decision-making and leadership and foreign policy. I'm looking at how the permanent representative to the United Nations works to convey the president's agenda, plays a role in the president's advisory team. So I'll say a little bit more about that today, but for the most part, I'll stick to the first question about how the United States has built international support through the UN, focusing on the three case studies of Korea, the Gulf War, Persian Gulf War, and Iraq. Just very quickly, a short history. The precursors to the UN, of course, we all know about the League of Nations, organization that existed officially from the end of World War I until actually the end of World War II. Though basically, by the early 1930s, the League of Nations had become defunct. The United States played no role in the League of Nations. President Wilson negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, advocated the creation of a League of Nations, traveled the country in the summer and fall of 1919 to build support, sacrificing his health and ultimately his life in the process. But Wilson refused to engage the concerns of congressional leaders, particularly Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr., who believed that there was a need to expressly make clear that the United States would not commit troops to League efforts, to League initiatives abroad without congressional support. Wilson refused to acknowledge that any changes were needed. He saw that as an infringement on executive authority, and he refused to accept any reservations, as they were called, to the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty actually got majority support in the Senate. It failed by 7 votes to get the necessary 2/3, but it did fail. And historians since then have pointed out Wilson's absolute refusal to engage Congress's concerns as a problem in the process. It might have been possible had Wilson been willing to work with Senator Lodge, who was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, had he brought members of Congress in the delegation to draft the League's charter, he might have addressed some of these concerns beforehand, but he didn't. And I mention this only to say that because we see how in 1945, FDR and then Truman learned from Wilson's mistakes. During World War II, so while the United States does not participate in the League of Nations, we do have a group of intellectuals, commentators who support the idea of an international organization. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded after World War I, in part by many supporters of the creation of an organization like the League. And in 1943, during World War II, the United States and Great Britain and China issued and the Soviet Union, issued the Moscow Declaration, where they said there was a need for an international organization to ensure international peace and stability. 1 year later, in Washington, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, named after the home in which it was held, the conference members issued a statement that the guiding principle of an international organization should be the sovereign equality of peace-loving states. So even as World War II continued, the states, led by the United States largely at this point, were looking to build an international organization that would promote democracy of sorts at the international level. In 1945, there was a conference in San Francisco, 9-week conference to draft the UN Charter. FDR, before he died, created the delegation for this charter, and he included members of Congress in large part, learning from Woodrow Wilson's mistakes. After FDR died, Truman supported this endeavor. And the UN treaty that was drafted in the spring of 1945 was approved by the Senate in July of 1945 with only 2 dissenting votes. So a sharp change from what happened in the fall of 1919 and actually spring of 1920 was the last time the League vote came up. The UN officially was created on October 24th, 1945. This year, the UN celebrates, of course, its 65th anniversary. Sorry, this year is Hofstra's 75th anniversary, so we have a lot of celebrations going on. But I think it's an appropriate time as we look at approach the 65th anniversary of the UN to evaluate what its successes have been, as well as its shortcomings or its challenges. Now, when President Truman, just 2 weeks after he took office, he addressed the San Francisco conference by radio. And this quotation doesn't, I think, have the same poetic ring that the first one did from the speech at UMKC. But he does point out here the basic democratic principle of the UN. Man has learned long ago that it is impossible to live unto himself. The same basic principle applies today to nations. We were not isolated during the war. We dare not now become isolated in peace. And so again, I think if you take the first quotation, it will be just as easy for nations to get along in a republic of the world as it is for us to get along in the Republic of the United States. You see the same principles at work in Truman's public communications, this commitment to sovereign states working together to promote peace. Obviously, and as I say this, I think we can see in 2010 that this was clearly very idealistic rhetoric. But these were the original aims when the United Nations was created. Now, the UN, before I get into my own case studies, of course, has 4 major institutions, though it was actually created with 5. The Trusteeship Council suspended its operations in 1994 after Palau was the last colony to gain independence. The Trusteeship Council was created as part of the UN to manage the transition from colonization to independence for many states in the developing world. But the principal institutions, of course, are the General Assembly, which Senator Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan once described as the town hall meeting of the world. The town meeting of the world. Every state has an equal voice in the General Assembly. Every state has an equal vote. And you have all of the participation, engagement, and conflict that you would expect with such direct democracy in the General Assembly. The Security Council is a more selective chamber with 5 permanent veto-wielding members. Of course, the victors from World War II, the United States, Great Britain, today Russia, China. Originally it was Taiwan, but Communist China took that seat in 1972. Actually, officially later on in the 1970s, and in France. So 5 permanent members, and today 10 rotating members who serve 2-year terms. Originally there were 6 rotating members. That number increased in the mid-1950s, I believe. The Economic and Social Council, and the International Court of Justice, commonly known as the World Court. My focus is going to be on the Security Council tonight. And let me just say, before I move into that, that in discussing the strengths and shortcomings of the Security Council, I don't want to diminish the other work that the UN does. I've spoken to a number of UN agencies and people who work at supporting organizations who have pointed out with great fairness that there are more than a dozen UN organizations, UNESCO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, which has had enormous success in vaccines, UNICEF. Right? The UN Population Fund. So there are a number of organizations that work on issues of social advancement, health, women's rights, drug control. Some with mixed success. There have been certain controversies. The United States, of course, withdrew from UNESCO several decades ago because of conflicts over what the educational goals of that organization were. So, but in my focus is the Security Council, because I think that when we look back at the fundamental purpose of the United Nations, the primary purpose was peace and security. And you can just look back at those quotations from Truman to see that. The goal was to bring peace-loving nations together to prevent future conflicts, such as World War I and World War II. Now, the Security Council itself, as I've said, was not a democratic institution. Unlike the General Assembly, it was selective, and the 5 permanent members had veto power were created with veto power over any actions that the Security Council might take. This, of course, makes decision-making extremely difficult, and we saw that during the Cold War. We'll talk about that in just a moment. However, President Truman's first permanent representative to the UN, Edward Stettinius, said that the veto power was needed because it simply recognized the power facts of life. That even in an international democracy, certain states would have a greater say than others. And that was the situation in 1945. I'm glad to discuss proposals for reforming the United Nations. There have been a number of them that have been made over the years, such as giving Japan a permanent seat on the council. Japan pays the largest share of UN dues after the United States. Of more regional participation, perhaps picking Brazil and India. Having a permanent representative from one of the states from Africa. The European Union, replacing Great Britain and France with a single European Union seat. All of these are proposals that have been discussed. In principle, the United States has said, the official United States position is that the U.S. does not oppose reforming the UN so long as the reforms don't affect the UN's effectiveness. And that, in effect, means that the U.S. is not going to push for major reforms. So we have an institution that is clearly a 20th century institution, and part of our challenge today is to figure out how the UN can be a 20th century institution can be most effective in the 21st century. Let me just say a little bit about the role that the U.S. ambassador to the UN can play in that process, and then I'll turn to the case studies. When we think of presidential advisors in foreign policy, who comes to mind immediately? Secretary of State, presumably. Right? In this administration, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Right? National Security Advisor? Anyone know?
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones, okay. Who was actually described, thank you, as a clown by one of General McChrystal's aides. That was particularly unfortunate, and I think maybe one of the reasons why General McChrystal will indeed have to resign. But General Jones is much more of a behind-the-scenes person, not as well known publicly as, say, a Henry Kissinger, who at one point was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State for Gerald Ford. Secretary of Defense, we need only look back at the last administration to see how the power conflicts that took place between Colin Powell's State Department and Donald Rumsfeld's Defense Department, right? Particularly in the decision-making leading up to the Iraq War. Presidential scholars traditionally focus on the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, the National Security Advisor, the Director of the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, obviously, is a recent position in the last 5 years. And this is the president's foreign policy team. Very little attention is paid to the ambassador to the UN. And as I said, the official title is permanent representative, but commonly known as the ambassador to the UN. And yet, if you look at the 30 people who have served as US ambassadors to the UN from 1945 to the present, you see some very interesting and important variations in their expertise and their access to the president. And their variations in those two areas have had, what I argue, an important effect on their role or their influence in presidential foreign policy making. And basically what I've put together is a classification that if you take foreign policy expertise and access to the president, you come up with 4 basic types of ambassadors: independent spokespersons, policymakers, personal advisors, and professional diplomats. And this is an easy way to look at the 2x2 diagram. Now, recognizing that the variation can be great here, but for purposes of categorization, if a U.S. ambassador has low foreign policy expertise and limited access to the president, they tend to be independent spokespersons who don't have much of a say in the process. Truman's primary U.S. Permanent rep, who was Warren T. Austin, falls into this category. Others, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, senator from New York. Very limited tenure at the UN, but would fall into this category. Sometimes we've had a few cases of ambassadors with relatively low expertise but high access to the president, who've had cabinet status. Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. for President Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson for President Kennedy. Kennedy was not at all fond of Stevenson. Many of Stevenson's supporters wanted Stevenson to be Secretary of State, but Kennedy didn't want him in that role. And oh, that reminds me, I'm very excited to be speaking here because Missouri, right, is the state where we kind of became part of, Missouri became part of history in 2008 because that was the first time since 1956 that Missouri didn't vote for the winning presidential candidate. Right? I thought that was interesting. That I thought of that with Stevenson because, of course, it happened with Stevenson, but everyone said, oh, well, Illinois, neighboring state. And when Missouri went for McCain, of course, it was a pretty close vote. There was kind of a question as to whether who's going to win in the presidential race. So at any rate, Adlai Stevenson, Illinois, someone who was beloved by the state of Missouri in 1956, fell into the category of personal advisor. We've had two of the other two case studies I'm going to discuss today, the Persian Gulf War and Iraq. We see permanent representatives who served as professional diplomats. These were career Foreign Service officers, Thomas Pickering in the first Bush administration, John Negroponte in the second Bush administration, who had long-term expertise in the career Foreign Service, but did not have cabinet rank. Nevertheless, and so their access to the president was through the Secretary of State. Nevertheless, what you see in both of those cases is a clearly structured process where the U.S. is engaged in the United Nations, and the U.S. ambassador plays a clear role working through the Secretary of State. James Baker in the first Bush administration, Colin Powell in the second. And I'll say more about that. I'm not going to talk about the last one today, about ambassadors who have high foreign policy expertise and high access to the president. But I think that these cases are very interesting, and if you'd like to discuss them after I finish the lecture, I'm glad to do so. So far, to date, only two permanent representatives have filled that role. Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke, both of whom served in the Clinton administration. Albright and Holbrooke both had cabinet rank, actually as does Susan Rice, though I would put Susan Rice more in the professional diplomat category, and I'll tell you why when I get to that case. But Albright and Holbrooke were participants in the decision-making process. In fact, Albright, you could argue, as U.S. ambassador to the UN, was probably more influential in the policy-making debates than the Secretary of State was in President Clinton's first term, Warren Christopher. And then, of course, she went on to become Secretary of State in the second term. Richard Holbrooke, as U.S. ambassador to the UN, was instrumental in renegotiating U.S. payment of back dues to the UN, and thereby making it possible for the U.S. to continue to participate in the UN into the 21st century. Part of my argument is that professional diplomats and policymakers those are the two categories in which presidents can benefit most from their ambassadors to the UN. They have the most, they reap the least benefits when they have independent spokespersons, and they have fairly limited, mostly personal advice when they use the personal advisor position rather than policymaking influence. But today I'll focus on the top two categories: Warren Austin as an independent spokesperson and the consequences of not using the permanent representative more assertively, and the merits of the professional diplomat approach. But let me do this in the context of discussing the case studies. I'll start with the Korean War, case study one. Let me get to the meat of this. North Korea invades South Korea in June 24th, 1950. President Truman is vacationing in Missouri. He returns to the White House, and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, quickly works through the Security Council to gain two resolutions. The first one condemns the North Korean invasion of South Korea. The second one authorizes the use of force to restore peace in Korea. Now, interestingly, that second UN Security Council resolution was passed after Acheson had already made a statement saying that the United States would provide air support to protect South Korea. So there's been a fair amount of scholarly debate about why Truman chose to operate through the UN and not through Congress to authorize the Korean War. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But let me start by saying, on the surface, this looks like a clear success for the United Nations. Right? That the United Nations would play a role in condemning interstate aggression. Security Council would use force, authorize force to combat such aggression. However, it's not really a good test case because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at that time to protest the decision, the UN's decision not to seat Communist China, to seat Taiwan. And so as a result, while we recognize, as we look at this case study, we can't possibly evaluate it without keeping in mind that had the Soviet Union been on the Security Council, the Truman administration almost certainly would not have been able to work through the Security Council for this resolution. I think in the first decade of the UN's existence, from 45 to 55, the Soviet Union exercised its veto extensively. And it was the boycott that made this possible. Now, President Truman was committed to working through the United Nations from the very beginning. In his memoirs, he wrote, of course this was after the fact, but he wrote, "The foundations and principles of the United Nations were at stake unless this unprovoked attack on Korea could be stopped. There was no suggestion from anyone that either the United Nations or the United States could back away from the invasion. This was the test of all the talk of the last 5 years of collective security." Right? This was the Truman's public record in evaluating the decision afterward. In the Truman Library, you can find a memorandum of conversation of the June 25th meeting convened at Blair House after Truman had returned from Missouri, where Truman said in the meeting, "We are working entirely for the United Nations. It was our idea, and in this first big test, we just can't let them down." One participant in the meeting has written in his memoirs that he heard Truman, before the meeting began, he saw Truman standing by a window, and he heard him saying almost to himself, "We can't let the UN down." And he said, he writes that Truman said this twice to himself. Was that historical fact? We don't know. We have one person's recollection, but we do know from the Memorandum of Conversation, Truman was determined to operate through the United Nations to get this resolution to condemn the invasion. What's interesting is that Truman was so focused on the United Nations and not at all attentive or concerned about getting a congressional resolution. Senator Taft from Ohio said that Truman has brought the Korean War about without consulting Congress and without congressional approval. This seems to me a complete usurpation by the president of authority to use the armed forces of this country. Now, today, I think that seems pretty clear. In the aftermath of Korea and Vietnam, they're both described as the undeclared wars of the 20th century. Political scientist Louis Fisher has written extensively about how unchecked presidential power began to develop with the Korean War. And he sees this as the problem of both executive assertion of that power and congressional reluctance to check it. Truman himself meets with congressional leaders 5 days after the invasion and says, "I just had to act as commander-in-chief, and I did." George Elsey, who's Truman's special assistant, said later, "It's quite certain that the president would never have asked for a resolution." Well, why? Historians have reflected on this and come up with a few reasons. One, no one anticipated that the war would be so long, that it would last 3 years and end in a stalemate. In fact, there's been no peace treaty ending the Korean War. We still have U.S. troops posted in South Korea. A recent analysis by Princeton historian Phil Zelikow says that Republicans criticized Truman publicly, but they criticized his refusal to get a congressional resolution, but they were actually relieved in the summer of 1950 to not have to go on record supporting the president. If you look at the historical context, October 1949, China fell to the communists. February 1950, Senator McCarthy makes allegations about card-carrying communists in the State Department. There were concerns, there were partisan debates about how the Cold War was being waged. And Republicans in Congress had some concerns about officially supporting the president. So there may have been some kind of, there wasn't Congress did, the president asserted this authority, and Congress didn't actively object. Also, Truman himself called this war a police action in June of 1950. Didn't expect it would last this long. Presidential scholars supported Truman. Arthur Schlesinger, a distinguished historian, said there are numerous cases, precedents, for presidents sending troops abroad without getting congressional approval. He cited Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates. But it's quite clear, if you look at the cases that Schlesinger cited, there was no similar initiative comparable in any way in terms of cost, number of troops, duration of conflict to the Korean War. And Schlesinger himself, when he wrote the book The Imperial Presidency in the 1970s, actually offered a mea culpa that he was wrong. Henry Steele Commager, another distinguished presidential scholar, publicly supported Truman and later expressed his regret. So if we take this first case study, what do we learn about the US, the UN, and foreign policy? It's a success story for the United Nations, certainly, but it's not necessarily the best case because of the absence of the Soviet Union. As far as presidential leadership, we see the first sign of an imbalance of power in American politics. And this is where, bringing in the research I'm doing on the US ambassador, I think if we look back and think about counterfactuals, had President Truman sought a congressional resolution in the summer of 1950, he likely would have gotten it. His political opponents might not have been pleased about going on record supporting him, but they would not have wanted to oppose a resolution condemning the invasion. And Senator Austin, well, former Senator Austin at that point, Ambassador Austin, had been a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, longtime dedicated internationalist who might have been able to assist the Truman administration in building that congressional support. But Austin was not a member of the president's inner circle, and the president's advisory team, along with Truman himself, decided that this wasn't necessary. So the Korean War is a kind of limited success story for the UN and kind of a cautionary tale for American politics. Right? The president sends troops abroad with UN, under the auspices of the UN, but without congressional support. If we move ahead 40 years to the Persian Gulf War, we have perhaps the classic case of intervention. Iraq invades Kuwait, violates the fundamental principle of the international system since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, that states have sovereign borders, right? Territorial integrity and political sovereignty, right? The rights of life, liberty, and property that individuals have, the international state system guarantees to states. Iraq violates those rights. President George H.W. Bush talks about a new world order in September of 1990. 2 months later, he secures a resolution authorizing all necessary means to force Iraq from Kuwait. And then days before the war begins, he also gets a congressional resolution. This case study is probably the model case study for U.S. intervention, for policymaking with the UN, and for presidential leadership in foreign policy. What one political philosopher, Michael Walzer, described as a just war. You have the permanent representative of the UN playing a limited role, but working through the Secretary of State. In the interest of time, let me move through this a little bit quickly so we have time to engage the discussion. All right. The UN Security Council resolution in November of 1990 passed with 12 votes, 2 noes, Cuba and Yemen, and 1 abstention, China. And that was highly significant because China opposed the resolution and could have vetoed it on the Security Council. Congress passes the bill narrowly in the Senate, a 52 to 47 vote, much wider majority in the House of Representatives. Now, why was George Bush willing to go through the UN and then through Congress? Well, George H.W. Bush came to the presidency with extensive experience in foreign policy. He had been permanent representative to the UN under Richard Nixon. He had served as the U.S. liaison to China. He had been director of the CIA. He had been vice president for 8 years. I work with Ed Rollins is a fellow at my center. He worked in the Reagan administration, and he and I taught a class together this spring. He said in 8 years, he saw Vice President Bush in meetings with the president, never once saw him utter a word. Mastered the art of professional diplomacy. Now, Bush writes in his memoirs that he was determined to work through the United Nations, not because he felt he had to, but that this was a way of building an international coalition of support. In the days after the invasion, he called more than 120 heads of state. And he writes that he had known many of them before they took office, and that helped strengthen trust. Now, when he spoke to Congress, September 11th, 1990, he spoke about a new world order, a world freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, more secure in the quest for peace. A world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle. A world in which nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice. A world where the strong respect the rights of the weak. We're now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by the founders. So you see here a clear commitment to working through the UN. Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker, in November of 1990, visits 12 countries over 3 continents in 18 days. He has written since then that November was the crucial month for securing the resolution because the United States chaired the Security Council. In December 1990, Yemen took over as president, and Yemen, of course, voted against the opposed the resolution. So the United States was on a tight timetable, but because the president was committed to working through the UN, Secretary of State, his permanent representative, were able to achieve this resolution. Bush, in his memoirs, credits his team for it. His national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, has written, "The UN gave us an added cloak of political cover." And this is interesting, signaling the ending of the Cold War. "We sought that resolution in order to settle doubts and to keep the Soviets on board." A big change from 40 years previously. As far as Congress, Bush maintained at the time that he didn't need a congressional resolution. Margaret Thatcher encouraged him to not go through either the UN or through Congress. You might remember she famously told him not to go all wobbly. He writes in his memoirs that even had Congress not passed the resolutions, I would have acted and ordered our troops into combat. I was comfortable in my own mind that I had the constitutional authority. Now, this is a somewhat troubling statement. And Lou Fisher, whom I mentioned earlier, who has criticized Truman's decision to not go through Congress from Korea, said, how did the president decide in his own mind that he had the constitutional authority? But nevertheless, despite his reasoning or his thinking, Bush did decide to seek a resolution in Congress. And this, again, makes the Persian Gulf War kind of the classic case study for intervention, I think. Success through the United Nations, success through Congress. Of course, the war was very short, leading Bush to say afterward that we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome. Kind of gave the Persian Gulf War became a model for Colin Powell, the Powell Doctrine, that if you if you engage in military conflict, you need clear goals and overwhelming force. Right? It's kind of been a textbook example of intervention. The third case, and I know we want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to go through this a little bit quickly, is, of course, Iraq. And what's interesting in the Iraq decision-making is that George W. Bush also seeks a congressional resolution and a UN resolution, following the model of his father, but he actually seeks the congressional resolution first, and then the UN resolution. And he actually does secure a UN resolution in November 2002. promising serious consequences if Iraq doesn't submit to arms inspections. The problem is that, so in some ways, in November 2002, and I remember this because I was teaching at West Point, and I took a class at the UN at the time. I was saying, well, George W. Bush did better than his father did. He got a unanimous resolution. His father had 2 opposing votes and 1 abstention. The problem was that unanimity was only on paper, and there was strong disagreement among the members of the UN Security Council in November 2002 as to what serious consequences meant. Now, it wasn't clear in August of 2002 that, it wasn't clear in August of 2002 that President Bush would go through the Security Council. Dick Cheney, Vice President Cheney, suggested that that wasn't necessary. Also even questioned whether it was necessary to go through Congress. But on September 12th, 2002, President Bush speaks to the UN General Assembly and asks 2 fundamental questions. The world now faces a test. You hear the echoes of Truman here. And the United Nations, a difficult and defining moment. Are Security Council resolutions to be honored and enforced or cast aside without consequence? Will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant? And then he goes on to say, my nation will work with the UN Security Council to meet our common challenge. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced, referring to resolutions calling for inspections, arms inspections in Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. The just demands of peace and security will be met, or action will be unavoidable, and a regime that has lost its legitimacy will also lose its power. Now, the Bush administration decides to seek a congressional resolution first, in part because of the midterm elections in November 2002, and they do secure the congressional resolution in October. The next month, as I mentioned, they secure the first UN resolution, 1441, that was approved unanimously, in which the Security Council writes that Iraq has been and remains in material breach of its obligations under relevant resolutions, in particular through Iraq's failure to cooperate with United Nations inspectors and the IAEA. The Council has repeatedly warned Iraq that it will face serious consequences as a result of its continued violations of its obligations. So, on the surface, it appears that George W. Bush followed the lessons of his father, getting support domestically and from the international community. However, in February of 2003, when the United States is preparing to go to war in Iraq, and the United States seeks a second resolution, Secretary of State Colin Powell makes that famous speech before the UN on February 5th, 2003, where he talks about the evidence that Iraq is building weapons of mass destruction, speech now that has been acknowledged, including by Powell himself. There was incorrect information in it. The Security Council is not, it becomes clear the Security Council will not approve a second resolution authorizing military force. And that's when the United States, the administration, begins to talk about the coalition of the willing. And of course, wages the war, again, with congressional support, but without a UN resolution specifically authorizing military action. So in these 3 case studies, we have one case study where a president worked through the UN, right? But it wasn't the battle that it would have been. The Cold War battle wasn't present because the key opponent, wasn't participating, and doesn't seek support from Congress. You have a president right in the aftermath of the Cold War who gets UN support and congressional support. And Secretary of State James Baker has said it was when he stood with Edward Shevardnadze, his counterpart in the Soviet Union, and they condemned the invasion. That was in his mind in August 1990 when the Cold War ended. And then you have a case in the 21st century where the United States says it wants to work through the United Nations and gets kind of an initial resolution, but then really is kind of pursues its plan of action without building that international coalition, at least through the UN. So where does that leave the UN in the 21st century? Well, whoops. If we go to President Obama's speech to the UN General Assembly last fall, President Obama says, this is just a beginning. Some of our actions have yielded progress. Some have laid the groundwork for progress in the future. But make no mistake, this cannot solely be America's endeavor. We have sought in word and deed a new era of engagement with the world. Suggests the role for the UN, though he doesn't get into the specifics. And now is the time for all of us to take our share of responsibility for a global response to global challenges. Echoes of the theme from his inaugural address, actually, where he talks about the responsibilities of citizenship writ large in the world. If you look at President Obama's recent national security strategy statement, which was released last month, there is a statement about the United Nations, says that the United States at times has engaged the UN on an ad hoc basis, and that the United States will need to invest in strengthening the international system, working from inside international institutions and frameworks to face their imperfections head-on and to mobilize transnational cooperation. Again, interesting language, that we need to work through international institutions, but not making the same statements, the kind of unabashed statements of support for the UN that Harry Truman did 65 years previously. So in conclusion, what does this mean for the presidency and the UN and foreign policy? Well, first I would say that presidential engagement with the United Nations depends in large part on the president's experience in foreign policy. And that's where I think George H.W. Bush provides the best example, that presidents who have engaged in international diplomacy are most comfortable in working through the UN. President Obama, of course, doesn't have that same degree of experience, but certainly commands strong popular support abroad. Perhaps the best indication of that is winning the Nobel Peace Prize, for which he was shortlisted less than 10 days after he took office, as a statement of kind of the world's support for President Obama. What that means as far as cooperation through the UN remains to be seen, but suggests at least, if not the president's experience in foreign policy, confidence from other nations. The president's advisors. I haven't said as much about the ambassadors to the UN, of that portion of this project, but you can see that ambassadors that are engaged in the process, the ones who worked in the H.W. Bush and Bush administrations, were much more effective than someone such as Truman's ambassador, who was much more really on the sidelines. And even Warren Austin's own biographer has written that Austin didn't participate in the decisions, he simply conveyed them to the UN. The president's commitment to the United Nations. I would put those last two variables together. Perhaps the best indicators of the U.S., the future of the U.S. and the UN will depend on how much presidents care about working through the United Nations and how much the international environment will give them the flexibility and the domestic political opportunity to do so. So I'll end with that question mark about the future of the UN, the U.S. and the UN in foreign policy, and open up for questions. Thank you.
I see my own country now, since the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, using the veto power over and over and over and over again, many times involving the Mideast and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, that leaves me in a quandary as to where there is truth. Maybe there is no such thing in international as truth, right, in an absolute sense. But I was wondering, to focus on that, could you make any comments concerning the U.S. role in comparison? And again, we've said it was on our soil, we have the United Nations here, we love it, and yet we are time and time again, decade after decade in fact, the biggest debtor to this wonderful organization. We are also the greatest supporter financially when we pay our bills, if we pay our bills. This all leaves me in a quandary. I love you this morning, by the evening I hate you. And Where do you feel that the U.S. is going to end up on this balance of confusing support and lack of support?
Well, you've raised a number of issues, and they're fair critiques. I mean, I think I'm not even sure if cautious optimism is the way to describe kind of prospects for the UN in the 21st century. Because cautious optimism kind of suggests that there's a future for the UN in promoting international peace and security, and kind of in the founding vision, to take Truman's quotations about, right, the rule of the world and the rule of man. It's just that hasn't come into existence, and there are reasons why. I'm not saying that that the criticisms have been unjust. It's also true that the UN is also, I would say, is more than a debating society, which is, I think, what what cynics say, that it's a place for states to talk, but then if you really want to get things done, you have to get the real players together. I think there's something in between there, and I'm not sure exactly what shape that collaboration or that diplomacy will take. But I think this is where it depends a lot on how much the U.S. is willing to invest, not just in terms of money. And you're right, in the Clinton administration, the United States renegotiated its dues. The U.S. pays about 22% of the general dues and about 25% of the peacekeeping dues. The total UN budget is about $15 billion, of which about $5 billion is peacekeeping, $2 billion is general budget, then another $8 billion for various different organizations, World Health Organization and others. And I think that given kind of the U.S. primary role in the UN, that makes the presidential leadership, or kind of the need for the president to be engaged to be committed to working with the United Nations, essential for anything to happen. I don't think that's likely to change. I think, when Senator Vandenberg described the General Assembly as the town meeting of the world, we've really come, although Truman never suggested that the United States would give up its sovereignty, that's much more the concern today. And there was concern in 1945 as well, certainly was in 1919, but that there would be great reluctance, I think, to change the UN because no one is convinced that you'd get something better. And I think that the United States, while it says on paper it supports expanding representation, doesn't want to give up its kind of hegemonic role. So I think there is... and you're making a fair point that just as the Soviet Union has blocked action by the Security Council, the United States has also promoted its own interests, right? Which is what you would expect it to do. But so that's not surprising. But I think there is a role for the UN Security Council to play in the 21st century that's more than a place for debate, but less than a forum for policymaking. And what that balance is depends largely on the administration. To take the current administration, Ambassador Rice just successfully shepherded through, working with Secretary Clinton, the resolution imposing sanctions on Iran. It's the fourth resolution imposing sanctions on Iran for building up its nuclear program. Now, does that resolution resolve the crisis? Certainly not. But I think you can make the case that engagement with other nations to build this coalition for containing Iran's nuclear program is useful for promoting U.S. interests.
But even there, you have one of the veto members who is not supporting that action against Iran. So again, you're in a quandary and a limited role. But again, it hasn't been. But it wasn't vetoed. Right.
So again, I'm saying that's where I'm saying the UN Security Council is not necessarily an international policy-making institution, but I think that the fact that the resolution was achieved shows that it's more than just a place where the states make speeches.
Well, and I think it was Churchill that mentioned when they were criticizing that all they do is something like gab, 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 and he said, well, gab, gab, gab is better than kill.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Fair point from 65 years ago. Yes.
Could you speak to the role of Israel and why you chose not to include it, I guess, in kind of the overall history of the UN and the U.S.? Because it seems to be a point of tension over and over again throughout, even from Truman all the way up to today.
Yeah, no, well, that's a good point. In part, I didn't get into that because with Israel, kind of probably, as far as the UN is concerned, probably the most important historic case is the General Assembly, right, passing the Zionism as racism resolution, and then Daniel Patrick Moynihan standing up and condemning the resolution. And that, you know, that's a very strong moment in American politics. But I think that, but the General Assembly is much more, I would say the General Assembly falls much more into the category of a debating society. So in that sense, I didn't think that I wanted to focus on cases of kind of major international conflict, and those are the ones that come through the Security Council. Now, that said, I think, you know, the U.S. alliance with Israel points out, you can kind of see a lot of the problems that that we have in the UN when you have these kind of international groups forming, right, that kind of have instinctive opposition, right? I mean, we go back to 1948, actually, Warren Austin, as they were planning the partition for the creation of Israel in 1948, Warren Austin went before the Security Council, actually in March of 48, and announced, well, if we can't get partition, we'll create a trusteeship. And the Truman administration was bombarded with criticism for apparently accepting the second best solution. And really what that reflected was opposition in the State Department to what Truman was doing. Truman was furious. He wrote in his diary, I found out this morning in the papers that the State Department reversed my policy. And then Austin had to go back to the UN and retract that. But I think that story is one, I think, that points out a lot of the difficulties with the United Nations of kind of the kind of regional conflicts or regional, it's not really even conflict, it's regional kind of disputes or, you know, kind of instinctive opposition that hinders action through the General Assembly. But I would say as of now, that hasn't really come up to the level of the major international conflict in the Security Council.
Yeah, it just seems to be a tension point over and over again.
Yeah.
With, you know, a thing that the United States views in a very distinct way from the rest of the world.
Right,
so.
Right. And one where I think the United States actually is able to operate more effectively outside the framework of the UN. Though I think, I mean, the Middle East peace process is one where I would say that the interesting story about Israel and kind of the United States is that today the change in presidency, right, doesn't necessarily mean a change in policy. And I think that the Middle East peace process has been stalemated for a while. And the shift from Bush to Obama hasn't really changed that at all. So I see it more of a foreign policy story, not so much a UN story. But in the project on permanent representatives, it certainly is an important part, just more from the General Assembly side. Yes?
Can you speak about the effect of the changes in media since when the first Iraq War, the starting of that sort of fracturing and dividing into a lot more networks and a reduction in role of the newspapers and a politicizing, whether it's for economic or real political reasons, of the sort of a lessening of news of some sort. And, you know, obviously the feedback to the politicians is either through direct votes or complaints. But has there been an effect? What can you say?
That's a great question. Actually, I thought you were going to make the Cold War reference of Adlai Stevenson and the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that was kind of Stevenson's shining point, shining moment at the UN when he brought the images. The U-2 images of the Soviet missiles in Cuba.
I'd like to comment because I was a very young kid, and that's something I remember my dad pacing the floor, and that was a news-related, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, but this was, Stevenson's, this was, what was October 24th. It was Thursday, October 25th, 1962. Stevenson confronts the Soviet ambassador on the Security Council, shows him the photos, and asks the question, and says, "Don't wait for the translation. Answer the question, yes or no. Has the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba?" And there's all this applause, and then the Soviet ambassador says, "I'm not in an American court of law. You'll have your answer in due course." And Stevenson says, "I'm prepared to wait until hell freezes over." And that was kind of portrayed as was Stevenson's moment of toughness, of kind of doing what the Kennedy administration wanted. In fact, Stevenson, behind the scenes, Stevenson really thought that the United States should publicly announce that it would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles from Cuba, which is what happened, but the U.S. didn't say so publicly. But that was one example of a kind of a public moment for the UN that we don't really see much of during the Cold War, except in moments such as the Moynihan speech condemning the Zionism as racism resolution. In the first Gulf War, that's an interesting question as far as kind of what role the media played in kind of influencing the president's decision. I have to say, in 1990-91, although the media played an important role in kind of coverage of the Gulf War and the information that was coming out about the Scud missiles that were hitting Israel once the war began, but in the lead up to the Gulf War, I think that was not a factor in the Bush administration deciding to go to the UN. The reasons why the Bush administration went to the UN were the president's commitment to an international alliance, his desire to build a coalition, his belief that this would kind of, what Scowcroft said, that this would engage the Soviets, make clear that this was the New World Order. This was the first example of the New World Order. In the second Bush administration, I have to say, I don't think it was the media that was the role there either. I think really more in Bush 2, what you see in the fall of 2002 is a president who decides, over the objections of some of his advisors, including his vice president, that he wants to follow the model his father set. And his father secured a UN resolution and a congressional resolution, and he decides to do the same. So I think the media plays a role in foreign policy making, but as far as the media, I don't think the media influenced the decisions that were made to go to the Security Council in these cases. You look like you have a response. It's a lot of stuff, but I think that when you look back at those cases, you can see other reasons, other interests that guided the decision making.
Well, I can also think about a more roundabout path because of the like UN bashing is much more occurring in.
Oh, that's true, but I was thinking more in terms of those three cases. I think probably a good example of where media visibility has played an important role in shaping U.S. policy in the UN is with the payment of the dues that Richard Holbrooke negotiated. And that was where you find someone, Holbrooke, despite what General McChrystal's aides described about him, actually what they described is right. He's a very persistent person, and Ambassador Holbrooke is very skilled at working with the media, and I think was very good as ambassador to the UN of both privately negotiating to address the interests of people like Senator Helms from North Carolina, and publicly making the case through the media. So I think that would be a good example of where the media can be used to kind of build coalitions of support for action.
Other questions? Well, we thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh, thank you. It was fun. It went by really fast. And I'm on the Hofstra website. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me or get in touch with Professor Newman, and he knows how to reach me. But everything, speaking of communication, everything is, we really are more of a global society today.
And there's still some goodies over here that